Wow, John, you got a really good and glowing introduction there.
I know, it's the whole rock star welcome. I do appreciate it. I don't want to dwell over much in your t-shirt, but I was going to come out here and say how sad I was that you weren't wearing the llama corn t-shirt. And now you are, so thank you. That makes me very happy. It's my favorite tech conference visual of all time.
Okay.
You've said that what you want to focus on for Ethereum over the next little while are scaling, privacy, and security.
Yes.
Are those still what are kind of front of mind for you?
I'd say so.
Yeah. I don't want to relitigate scaling. We just talked about it for half an hour. I just had one question that popped into my head. So people criticize proof of stake on a theoretical level on the claim that it sort of makes the rich get richer and centralizes influence that way. I take it you don't agree?
That's definitely, at least I feel, one of the less kind of like good criticisms of proof of stake is like, look at proof of work, right? Like Bitmain's two mining pools collectively own something like 43 to 40, something like that, % of all of Bitcoin's hash power. If you add in, I think, via BTC, which is basically kind of affiliated with Bitmain, altogether you have 53%. So you already have this kind of like fairly small mini cartel that has 53%, and that's 53, which is 51% plus 2, for those who can't add, of the Bitcoin network's hash power. And like back in 2013, when Ghash briefly hit 51%, like that was a big, huge scare moment, and everyone really complained a lot. And eventually, like Ghash diplomatically backed down and voluntarily dropped themselves to 40%. But now, like it's basically happening a second time, and people just aren't really talking as much. And then this time around, right, these aren't just pools, right? Like, sure, technically there are pools that people can participate in them, but it's basically a plausible deniability strategy where a very large portion of that is just hardware owned by a very small number of concentrated actors, including the operators themselves. And from the outside, you can't really tell exactly how much actually is a real pool and how much is just a front for their hardware. So, like, first of all, there's clearly large incentives to hide the real level of centralization and proof of work for like public relations reasons. And clearly, even despite that, we can tell that the top three, this like very well-coordinated group of pools together has over half of the hash power. And like we can talk about geographic concentration. So a couple of days ago, there was that flood in Sichuan in China, and that led to something like 20% of the hash power just suddenly getting knocked offline. So like proof of work is like rich gets richer squared. Right? So if we can get to rich getting richer to the power of 1, that's already a substantial improvement.
All right. Let's talk about security for a moment. Ordinary people read headlines about Ethereum hacks and wrongly think that Ethereum has been hacked. And of course, it's smart contract developers writing vulnerable or buggy code. Can you talk about what you have in mind to improve the state of affairs there?
Sure. So I guess so. One of the important things there is that we need kind of continued ongoing development of better and more secure programming languages and standards. So, danke. So one of the examples of this is that like recently another high-level programming language, so something that compiles down to EVM code, was released at least as a beta called Viper. And Viper is a language that was designed from the start to be kind of more restrictive and target readability and security more and basically make it harder to screw up and make it harder to write deliberately misleading code. So the design process for Viper basically was, like take a kind of Python-like language, add a much stronger type system, and then look at the biggest, like 10 screw-ups in Solidity programming history and try to make features that deliberately make those as hard as possible, or like impossible entirely. And that's been launched. That's released as a beta, and that's something that's going to be developing. I think gave a grant to a group that was trying to make another high-level language for Ethereum that was based on more kind of functional programming principles. So we are trying, and then in Solidity itself, there's been a lot of improvement over the last year or so with like safe math libraries, like different, like stricter checks and all of those things. So there are kind of multiple prongs of innovation happening on the programming language side that I do think will make writing a lot of these contracts more and more safe over time. Another thing that we're doing has to do, and wants to do more, has to do with like basically just having good code samples and code templates. So if you want a multi-sig wallet, where do you go? What do you implement? For components that are that standard, there should just be standardized versions that have been audited, that have been formally verified, that they are ready to use, right? And that's something that's not there yet, but is getting closer and closer to being there. And so I think with better languages, better standards, better templates, better defaults, we can get to really reducing the smart contract security issues by a lot. And probably to the point where at some points private key security once again becomes a dominant issue, and then that's something that we want to really tackle as well.
Since you bring up Solidity bugs and multi-sig wallets, there's a bunch of money sitting out there in what Sam called a long-term savings account because of the parity multi-sig lost in limbo bug. What do you think is going to happen to that money ultimately?
Well, so the only way that it can ever move, right, is if there's two ways that it can move. One way is that the Ethereum community agrees on a hard fork to move it, basically do some like modification to the contract's code in place or move the money somewhere else so it can be recovered. And like that's continues to be it's totally mathematically possible to do that, but at the same time, we saw with EIP 999, and there was that Carbon vote which ended up voting against it. There was quite a bit of negative feedback on the GitHub. So, in the short term, it seems like there's the political will is quite far from being able to actually push something like that forward. The second way through which something like it can happen is, of course, if someone makes another blockchain which basically like hard spoons or airdrops or whatever, like all of the Ethereum account balances, but makes the one modification to unlock the wallet. And that's something that's like theoretically totally could happen, and it's like technically one way in which that wallet could become, those funds from that wallet could become usable in some way, like without kind of like compromising the blockchain's immutability by itself. Yeah. So, like, ultimately it is the community's decision, and I want to try really hard to kind of not be, myself be super heavily involved in influencing that, but, you can kind of look at what all of the other people in the community have been saying, the opinions that people have been expressing in some of the governance discourse so far, and to kind of see for yourself, where the state of the discussion is at right now, what is the chance that it'll end up changing in the future, and so forth.
Yeah, that leads me to, I want to ask about your own role. I mean, right now you're both the sort of celebrity public face and driving force behind Ethereum, and also kind of its chief scientist. And
I want to make Carl be the public face. Like, wasn't he great?
He
right
was,
now?
in fact, yes. Yeah. He's a natural. Yeah. That was kind of my question. So who's the Steve Ballmer to your Bill Gates if you retreat back to chief scientist? So Carl makes sense.
I'll admit to not be kind of well-versed enough in Microsoft history to know like Steve Ballmer's exact role beyond standing up angrily on stage and ranting about developers and something about open source being cancer and whatever. But
I should probably apologize to Carl for that analogy, actually.
Yeah, no, I mean, so first of all, there's I.M. Iaguchi, the executive director for the foundation, who's been doing quite a good job of kind of holding the fort on the administrative side and making sure that the foundation kind of keeps on smoothly rolling, and the bureaucracy does more good than harm.
And you think you yourself are going to be stepping back a little from?
I've been stepping back from that side for quite a while. There's obviously kind of all of the individual team leaders. There's a lot of other people kind of on the management side that have been involved in organization. There's more and more different people working on research, different people working on development. Another important difference between the Ethereum Foundation and something like Microsoft is that the Ethereum Foundation tries kind of very hard to be a decentralized organization. And definitely not singling out Microsoft specifically, right? Like pretty much all corporations are centralized organizations. But like in the Ethereum Foundation, right, like for example, we try very hard not to, not to have very hard divides of like you're on the inside, you're on the outside. This is a company party, no one from the outside is allowed. And in like this thing is company members only and so forth. Like basically because well, there's multiple ways to interact with the Ethereum community kind of through the Ethereum Foundation, right? Like you can become a full-time contributor, you can apply for a grant, and right now the budget of our grant program is larger than the budget of the Foundation's full-time staff itself. You can work for some project in the Ethereum ecosystem, like something like Omise Go, and at the same time just end up collaborating with Ethereum Foundation developers and researchers closely. So like basically the kind of the de jure question of like who is on what kind of payroll, and the de facto question of like who's a core member of the team, whatever the team is, often end up diverging quite a lot, and that's something we try hard to respect.
Let's talk about privacy, another of the areas we're focusing on. The last Ethereum release had some precompiled zero-knowledge primitives in it, which is the kind of mind-bending cryptography that Zcash, for instance, uses to shield the sender, the receiver, and the amount of a transaction from other eyes, even though it's all publicly verified and guaranteed on the blockchain. And are you moving more in that direction? And adding more
absolutely,
tools like that?
yeah. So first of all, so what we did last year in October is we released this update called Byzantium that, as you just said, opened up these elliptic curve mathematic operations that basically optimize the math behind all sorts of privacy-preserving cryptographic and zero-knowledge proof constructions. And there are already projects that are starting to use them to build various kinds of privacy-preserving applications, right? Like, I know there was one person in the community that was building a ring signature mixing contract. There was one guy, I forget, Barry Whitehead or something, I don't even know who he actually is in person, who had just released something on Reddit about a month ago where he's like, oh, look, I used the ZK snark function of precompiled in Ethereum and Socrates to build a zero knowledge shielded token, and it's already running on the testnet, and theoretically it could run on the mainnet tomorrow. So, like, those kinds of signs are always really encouraging to see. In the longer term, I think our kind of privacy roadmap has a few parts to it. One of them is just kind of raw virtual machine optimization, because the problem is basically that the virtual machine as it exists today is totally not optimized for cryptography. And if we want, if the virtual machine is faster, then that means that more kinds of cryptographic primitives can be implemented, right? Like the current VM can be good for certain kinds of 256-bit stuff, but there is a much wider space of things that it's still not really performing well in right now. But we have efforts like WebAssembly and so forth to try to really improve on that. A second one is kind of participating in and supporting the development of zero-knowledge proof technologies. So including kind of like the tooling around Snark, so like we supported Socrates, including development around Stark. So like I personally have written some of those Stark tutorials, and we plan to be doing much more with Starks in the future. Trying to kind of see like what would it take to actually make the Ethereum blockchain be friendly to Starks. So that includes, for example, like supporting finite field operations and other things involved in like Stark verification, looking at much more optimized hash functions. So all of the kind of like technological building blocks to make it easier to build zero-knowledge preserving, privacy-preserving schemes on top of the Ethereum blockchain. And then a third part of the research is probably that we haven't started yet, but we want to start in, is looking at kind of computing models that could be built on top of Ethereum and how the Ethereum base layer could be kind of modified to make it easier to build like more kind of well-designed programming abstractions for privacy on top. So That includes zero-knowledge encrypted smart contracts. It includes all of these privacy-preserving tokens. Like basically, how do we make it so that these things aren't kind of like clumsy one-offs that can't really talk to each other and have a kind of privacy-preserving smart contract ecosystem that's as friendly to interact with as the existing totally not privacy-preserving smart contract ecosystem?
So privacy preservation is a complex topic. I mean, Zcash and Monero are kind of banned in Japan right now. The Secret Service recently expressed concern about Zcash. Are you concerned that this is going to attract kind of stern regulatory attention somewhere down the road?
I mean, I'm sure it'll happen, though at the same time, I think it's important to kind of keep in mind that, like, in a lot of these cases, and like in the case of Ethereum as well, like these are general purpose technologies, and they can be used, like definitely not just by criminals. They can be used, like first of all, by ordinary people just trying to hide or protect the privacy of their payments. They can be used by enterprises who need the privacy features to satisfy regulatory requirements. Ironically enough, they are needed. They can be used by like various kinds of like applications and constructions on the blockchain to try to minimize front running and market manipulation. They can be used to create, to improve various kinds of mechanisms like auctions, because the game theoretic proofs for why a lot of these mechanisms even work in the first place often has to do with some mechanism that's capable of preserving privacy of a lot of the inputs. So there's a lot of kind of legitimate and a lot of perfectly tame uses for a lot of these technologies. And also a lot of these technologies aren't there just for privacy, they're also there for scalability, right? Like more than half of the excitement in ZK Snarks and ZK Starks isn't even because of the privacy angle, it's because they allow you to prove arbitrarily complex computations in a single proof that can be very compact and verified in a few milliseconds. So I do hope that like people see this kind of like this much wider array of general purpose applications for privacy technologies. Like both in systems like Zcash and like more general purpose array of Ethereum applications and so forth.
So I mean, absolutely. Yeah. But it seems like that at some point someone is going to use Ethereum for something which is perceived as nefarious. So
here's my argument, right? I agree that this exists. I actually disagree that we're going to marginally contribute to it much. And the reason is that like realistically the darknet markets are already using Monero. So there's not much that we can do to kind of like make the state of affairs from like that standpoint kind of like larger than it already is. But on the other hand, like if we continue working on usability and if you continue working on the kind of quality and security of these technologies, then we get the benefit that the technologies become more ready and accessible for use by regular people for privacy and security applications.
And if like some knee-jerk regulator comes to you and looks at your history of hard forks and says, we have this thing we need you to fix, we see you can fix it, do you think you'll be able to talk them into seeing sense, or do you think there'll be something to stand up?
So I expect that the probability of like regulatory responses that try to target blockchains themselves to be fairly low, basically because that's not the 80-20, right? The 80-20 is basically just banning exchanges. So if they have problems, they'll ban exchanges first, and that's like the thing with developers is, right, that we're fairly fungible people. Like we can kind of, like one developer goes down, someone else can keep on developing. If someone puts a gun to my head and tells me to write a hard fork patch, I will definitely write a hard fork patch. I will write the GitHub issue. I will write up the code. I will publish it. I will do everything they say. If I do this and I publish a hard fork patch to delete a bunch of accounts, how many people here would be willing to download and install the update and switch to that chain? I see relatively few raised hands. This is called decentralization.
Let's move on to something a little more fun.
Sure.
There's
Yeah, I don't really like being forced to write hard fork patches at gunpoint as much as I'm sure I'd oblige if people asked.
Yeah, it's probably not much fun as it looks on television. There's a lot of buzz about tokens for gaming and virtual collectibles, CryptoKitties being the most obvious example. So first I have to ask, do you personally own any CryptoKitties?
I think like 2 people gave me a couple of CryptoKitties, and I haven't really looked at them since, but they're around.
There's also buzz about tokens being used for like in-game items for video games, like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely kind of excited to see that there's interest in that kind of ecosystem. I'll admit to kind of not being immersed enough in the collectible game world to really understand, to kind of understand the psychology of it well. So it's just because of that, it's kind of hard for me to make predictions. Like, I get that there's a lot of people that wants to be able to trade various kinds of in-game assets. At the same time, I know that like back in my days playing World of Warcraft, like the like Blizzard and the World of Warcraft community were very heavily against kind of allowing real money trade, and they were in favor of like persecuting it as much as possible, basically because they like the idea that World of Warcraft was this kind of neutral playground where you can't just easily get ahead by throwing a bunch of money at the problem. And though I do know that like more recently they've kind of given up on that more and more. I mean, like basically the problem, like I do kind of worry about this intersection of like basically how efficient markets end up interacting with the psychology of fun, which often inherently ends up involving the psychology of challenge, and how if it's not really that like if you can just dodge the challenge by paying $245 to a guy who runs a human farm in like India or China or wherever they're located these days, then I don't know, like clearly there's a bunch of complex issues, and I'm kind of looking forward to, from an observer's point of view, seeing how that aspect happens. Though, like in the context of like asset tradability actually happening, I do think that it happening on a blockchain is a great idea because, like, it does mean that it creates this more neutral playing ground where you don't need, like, you don't have centralized providers that end that end up kind of like taking over in the ecosystem as rent seekers. You have much more interoperability. It becomes much easier for newer games to kind of plug themselves in. It's you get you get a lot of the existing infrastructure that's been created by the crypto community to facilitate trading. It would be interesting to see what happens when a game server gets hacked for the first time, and because it's running Plasma, everyone's Plasma clients just automatically notice that the Plasma server is like starting to misbehave and just send their exit transactions onto the blockchain, and you see this really wonderful big splat with a bunch of transaction fees. Like it'll happen at some point. It'll just be interesting to see how it happens. And I mean, in general, it does seem like a good sort of next stage use case to bring the technology closer to the mainstream.
What do you see the user experience being like? Like, suppose you've got arbitrary scalability, you've got millions of people trading in-game assets. Are they all actually going to, dig out their own wallets and sign their own transactions, or will they even be aware that there's a blockchain, parceling them out behind the scenes? Or how do you see it?
It depends. Like a lot of this depends on where user authentication technologies go in the next decade or so. It's like basically, right, like a user with a user with a private key. So there's not that much user experience difficulty of like signing your own transactions, right? It's not just that scary. You basically just click a button, and there's software running on your computer that does a bunch of elliptic curve multiplications. You create this like pile of mathematical gunk, and you upload the pile of mathematical gunk to the blockchain, and 16,000 other nodes on the blockchain verify the mathematical gunk, multiply up a bunch of elliptic curve points, and you're done, right? But like, all you see is you click a button and you see a confirmation. The place where the user experience kind of starts fraying is basically what happens if either your account gets hacked or if you lose your password. And that's the aspect of user account authentication technologies that I'm interested in seeing where it evolves, right? Because ultimately, if kind of quote self-sovereign user authentication technology just ends up totally failing, then that means that it is very difficult for the blockchain space to achieve substantial mass adoption, or at least in a way that achieves like a lot of its promises.
You think we're going to see like a one password for the blockchain private keys, or a decentralized one password for?
I mean, possible. That's one option. Like, I'm interested in social recovery. I'm interested in kind of multi-key schemes where you have one key and some server has one key. like social account recovery is interesting. Like basically, this is even used in some centralized systems today. So like for example, if you lose access to your WeChat accounts, then one of the ways that you can recover it is you can kind of basically try logging into the account, and then you have to like basically select like part of the security question is basically recognize which of these accounts are actually your contacts. And then after that, you basically, the WeChat sends some of your contacts confirmation codes, and you have to tell them what kind of off the chain, quote offline to reply back with a message confirming those confirmation codes. And then if they do that, then your account gets unlocked, right? So it's kind of M-event social recovery. And I know like Uport is trying to do that on the blockchain, so I'm trying to I'm very interested in seeing how well those kinds of things end up turning out in practice. I mean, there's obviously hardware wallets, there's different forms of multi-sig, there's like combined computer phone stuff. Like, I'm hoping that we'll see much more of these models get tried, and then we'll see if there is anything that ends up being both good enough for regular people to use and actually secure enough for regular people to be secure. And if not, then like we'll just fall back to everyone using coin-based custody or whatever, and that'll be much less fun, but it'll probably still kind of work, and it'll be better than the status quo.
The first wave of ICOs was for utility tokens, and there's a lot of buzz lately about security tokens, which actually are shares in a company or fractional ownership of real estate. Do you think that's a significant development, and do you think how big do you think it's going to be compared to utility tokens?
I mean, tokenizing real-world assets, whether they're securities or gold or bonds or like fiat or like I don't know, like pixels of some Banksy photo or whatever, I think is like all interesting. I guess the question is, what value are you getting by blockchainifying it? And the value that I personally see is that, like, first of all, you get access to this open like ecosystem of tools where you can trade these tokens, and you can do things with them. You can use them as collateral in other applications. You can use them as a means of payments. You can store them. You can do financial contracts off of them, and all of this. And this is all happening on an open ecosystem. And so basically, any ERC20 token could work with any application that supports ERC20 tokens. And I could see how a lot of innovation could potentially end up springing out of that. So that's something that I'm definitely kind of excited by. As far as like tokenizing art, I know there's people excited about that, though I know there's also like not that much of that happening in practice, and I know there's people skeptical of it. Like, it doesn't seem psychologically that easy for people to make the leap from paying $40 million for a Mona Lisa painting to paying $40 million for a digital private key thingamajig that claims that it has some arbitrary attachment to a Mona Lisa painting. And that's like, okay, fine, I understand that. I don't really understand the art world in general anyway, when you can just like take a painting and then like make a copy that looks almost identical. I don't know, yeah.
You're talking about exchanges a bit. Obviously, tokens are traded on exchanges, which is a huge business. We're seeing interesting growth in decentralized exchanges, the 0x protocol, AirSwap, and so forth. And everyone agrees we're in the early days of cryptocurrencies. Do you think there's a chance that down the road, decentralized exchanges will be where the majority of the action is, and centralized exchanges were like an ephemeral blip? Or do you think there'll be a bizarre occasional use case?
And I definitely personally hope centralized exchanges burn in hell as much as possible. I mean, in practice, like first of all, clearly I think on the fiat to crypto side, it's very difficult to decentralize because you ultimately are interfacing with the fiat world, and the fiat world is one that only has basically centralized gateways. So I do think that there's valuable services that are being provided there that are very hard to decentralize. On the crypto to crypto side, like I do think that like it's still early days and the technology is going to become more and more efficient over time. And at some point, we are going to see a world where it becomes much easier to fairly quickly turn a token of one kind into a token of any other kind. like basically with the decentralized exchanges available today, right? Like one of the nice things is that they already have a nice usability gain, which is that you don't have to like register or log in, create an account, go to some stupid web interface. All you do is you just send tokens of one type to one address, and then you immediately get tokens back of another address. It's like, from a user experience point of view, it's great. And I mean, that is obviously something that needs to be refined a lot more around the edges, but it's something that I do think we are going to kind of start seeing more and more of. Now, where like large-scale traders, professional traders, like the high-frequency trading ecosystem and so forth are going to go, that's it still remains to be seen, and it is a we'll see how the technology goes. I'm kind of fairly uncertain on this. So, like, ultimately, I guess the better even if centralized exchanges end up having a lot of volume, like the better decentralized exchanges are at the as a baseline, kind of the more happy I am, because that way we can really like take away this stupid king-making power that these centralized exchanges have, where they have this ability to just decide which tokens become big by just deciding to list them and then charging these crazy $10 to $15 million listing fees. And like the more we can get away from that world and into something which actually, like satisfies the blockchain values of openness and transparency, the better.
This is a weird cultural question I've wanted to ask for ages, but the Bitcoin world, which I know reasonably well, which you come from, is full of fury and hatred and personal feuds and Reddit censorship and people constantly sniping at one another and conspiracy theories. And I'm not saying that in the Ethereum world everyone sits together and sings Kumbaya all the time, but there seems to be substantially less in the way of strife. Why do you think this is?
I think part of it is what I had mentioned before, which is that kind of people know what the social contract is. And so there isn't this scenario where, like plenty of people just kind of, including me, assumed all along that like when the number of transactions hits the block size, the thing that will obviously happen is the block size will just get a hard fork to keep on increasing. And then other people have a different idea, and the two sides just totally don't even realize that there's the other side that had a totally different conception for them, and then they kind of like start fighting to maintain their expectations. Like in our case, the social contract was always one in favor of ongoing evolution, proof of stake, sharding, and there definitely are disagreements about how best to implement some of these technologies, but at the same time, like there's, at this point, like people, I think, to the extent that those disagreements exist, everyone involved in the disagreement is convinced that their opponent, the thing that their opponent in the disagreement proposes, even that in its pure form, is vastly better than any of the current systems. And so people see that their goals are kind of like aligned in favor of moving forward, and people understand what forward means and like what the sacrifices are required to get there. Part of it, I think, also is that like communities definitely kind of grow around, the growth of a community depends a lot on what its kind of earliest members believe and what its earliest members actively say, and the kind of values its earliest and kind of perceives to be sort of like the perceived high priests end up promoting. And so that's like I think it is something where we do make a deliberate effort to like basically promote both by kind of to promote the right values and try to attract the right people, both in an inclusive sense and in an exclusive sense. And in exclusive sense basically means trying to create a culture which is hostile to people who take themselves way too seriously.
Just going from your sartorial choices collectively, I think you're doing okay. But yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. People who take themselves way too seriously are just like so uninspiring. That's another part, and then also there's like the aspect of just what Ethereum is trying to do, and the kind of the goals that people doing Ethereum have, like including kind of social and political goals, including goals of like what they see decentralization as meaning, what they see the blockchain space as being fundamentally about. Like the Ethereum community has like basic income projects, it has like radical market projects, it has voting on the blockchain projects, it has prediction market projects, and like all of these. And then we try to kind of also really value intellectual diversity and value a healthy kind of intellectual diversity. And that's something that I've been, and I'm definitely very happy that I've like both I personally and a lot of other kind of core people in the Ethereum community have been exposed to those values from fairly early on. Another thing is, of course, kind of valuing just technology and technological progress, including things like cryptography, like taking like Byzantine fault tolerance theory seriously, like like zero knowledge proofs, NARCs, STARKs, working closely with the communities that are building those technologies, working with other blockchain communities that are building those technologies, just not being maximalist.
Yeah. Ethereum, of course, is public and permissionless, and anyone can participate. In fact, you can't stop people from participating. But of course, there's a whole movement in private or consortium Ethereum blockchains. And where do you think the line is between where those are useful and where those should just be a replicated database with an API?
So I definitely am less optimistic about private and consortium blockchains than I was 2 or 3 years ago. Basically because there's this bubble and there were a lot of promises and like, oh my God, IBM makes $200 million savings by putting something on a blockchain, and I have no idea what they actually did. They probably just like digitized something that was paper before, and like, great. Like basically what we ended up seeing is that a lot of these initial pilot projects just ended up not going very far. A lot of them ended up happening more slowly than everyone expected. A lot of them, and some of them end up just not being decentralized at all, right? Like there was one project I remember that was presenting, and it was this some Ethereum-based consortium chain. And like their code on GitHub basically is like a fork of Ethereum with some like consortium BFT algorithm put in instead of the proof of work. And when they talk about their actual deployment, like they talk a lot about how, oh wow, this is a business blockchain thing that's actually been running for over a year in production. Actually, their blockchain has 7 nodes, and all of these nodes are controlled by the same company. So like, this is where a lot of these projects are at, right? And the main problem basically is, I think, the reason why these systems are having a hard time is basically the reason why they had a hard time in the 1990s and the 2000s, the entire 25 years between when Leslie Lamport's Byzantine Generals paper came out and we had access to decentralized consortium consensus algorithms up until, like the birth of like Bitcoin and more broadly crypto economics, which basically is that creating decentralized consortia that are credibly decentralized is hard, right? Like, what often happens in these cases is that the first major company manages to join, but then you start hunting for the second and the third company. And the second and third company, they're not as excited about joining because, like, basically they're concerned that the system they're joining will turn them into vassals of the first big company to join and their pet little startup. And it seems that projects just have often a hard time of kind of getting out of these ruts, pulling these consortia together, getting people to kind of actually cooperate in that kind of setting. And whereas with the public approach, you have a network of 16,000 computers that actually can make much more credible commitments toward, like, basically not turning into some kind of monopolistic cartel. And that's something, an infrastructure that people like are willing to build on. So I think first of all, I totally agree that in a lot of industries, compromises between the kind of utopian ideals and the real kind of resilience benefits of decentralization on the one side, and the real kind of efficiency needs and sometimes regulatory needs of centralization on the other side are very much needed. I just don't think but consortium chains are not the only way to make that compromise, right? Like plasma chains, even plasma chains that act as centralized servers are another way to make that compromise. And I think in many cases there might even be a better way to make that compromise, right? Like what you do is you basically do whatever the centralized thing is that you were doing before, but then like basically incorporate the Merkle trees, incorporate blockchain commitments in the right way, not the wrong way. And you build a client, and you have an interface where the server basically just keeps on publishing Merkle branches to the client. And then into the client, you give them the ability to do participate in this plasma exit mechanism. And there you go. You have a system that has the efficiency of a centralized server, almost the same code as a centralized server. You just have to add a wrapping layer on top. But it also has this kind of resilience of having a public chain fallback if the server ends up breaking. And
I'm going to sneak in a super quick final question since we have 40 seconds left.
Sure.
Which other blockchains interest you by which we can measurably, which other blockchains do you actually have private keys for experimental reasons or whichever?
Ooh, well, a lot of this is kind of historical reasons, but Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin Gold, I don't know, that's Bitcoin Uranium, Bitcoin Diamonds, Bitcoin Carbon Dioxide. No, let's see. I got some Doge. I think I got some Zcash, and all sorts of Ethereum-based tokens.
Right.
Yeah.
All right.
From a kind of technical standpoint, I do find the Zcash team, interesting and highly competent, and I do value their kind of clear and kind of well-expressed commitments to privacy. I think they're one of the other projects that's really gotten the culture thing down well.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just go to people.